May 8, 1945. The guns went silent across Europe. Nazi Germany was dead. Hitler was a corpse in a Berlin bunker. American soldiers kissed strangers in the streets of Paris. Church bells rang from London to Rome. The war was over. But somewhere east of Berlin, in a frozen field surrounded by Soviet wire, an American soldier named Private James Kowalski pressed his face against a wooden fence post and watched Soviet guards replace German guards. Same rifles, same watchtowers, same wire, different uniforms, different flag, same prison. He had survived Auschwitz's neighbor camp. He had eaten rats to stay alive. He had watched men die from cold, so brutal it cracked their teeth. And now, on the day the world celebrated freedom, James Kowalski was still behind wire. Not German wire, Soviet wire. And nobody was coming. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Don't miss the next parts of this incredible story. Join our community as we uncover more hidden moments from history that will shock you. Let's explore together the stories they never taught you in school. 5,000 American soldiers, liberated by Soviet forces, never sent home. And one general was about to do something so dangerous, so unauthorized, that it would bring American and Soviet tanks face to face on a German border and nearly start World War III before the ink on the peace treaties was even dry. This is the story nobody talks about. June 3rd, 1945. General George S. Patton sat in his headquarters in Bavaria and read a report that made him grip the paper until his knuckles turned white. Sitting across from him was Captain Robert Shaw, 29 years old, former auto mechanic from Detroit, Michigan, the kind of man who fixed engines for $12 a day before the war turned him into a soldier. Shaw was thin. His uniform hung off his shoulders like wet laundry. His eyes had the hollowed look of a man who had seen things that didn't leave. Shaw had been captured during the German offensive in late 1944. He spent months in a German camp near Dresden. When Soviet forces rolled through in May, he thought his nightmare was ending. A Soviet officer shook his hand, called him comrade, told him he was free. Shaw wasn't free. He was marched east. 3 days on foot, always away from American lines, always deeper into Soviet-controlled territory, always further from home. On May 8th, the day the war officially ended, Shaw and 300 other Americans arrived at a former German transit camp in Soviet-controlled Poland. Red banners replaced swastika flags. Soviet guards replaced German ones. But the wire was the same. They were told it was temporary. Processing, documentation, medical evaluation, paperwork. Be patient. Shaw was patient for 3 weeks. Then he stopped being patient and started being dangerous. He noticed the guards were lazy, bored men who expected no trouble. They smoked cigarettes and argued about football while American prisoners paced inside the wire. Shaw spent 2 weeks studying the fence, the guard rotations, the blind spots, the timing. He found a section in the northwest corner where 2 guard paths crossed and left a 12-second gap every 40 minutes. He sharpened a piece of wire against a concrete floor for 9 days. On the night of May 28th at 2 in the morning, he cut through the fence 1 strand at a time. 20 minutes of silence and shaking hands. Then he was through. He didn't run. Running attracted attention. He walked into the forest like a man who owned it. 3 days west through Polish countryside, sleeping in ditches, eating whatever he could pull from the ground, drinking from streams that tasted like mud. On May 31st, he stumbled onto a road and saw an American Jeep. The driver stared at him like he was a ghost. Shaw said 7 words. "I'm Captain Robert Shaw. I escaped Soviet custody." Everything changed after that. The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Intelligence officers passed Shaw's testimony up the chain, division to corps, to army, to SHAEF, and then it landed on Patton's desk in Bavaria, like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Patton read it twice. He called for his intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch. Koch had been quietly gathering information for weeks, cross-referencing testimony from other escaped prisoners, piecing together a picture that nobody in Washington wanted to look at. Koch placed a folder on Patton's desk. Inside were names, ranks, serial numbers, testimonies, reconnaissance photographs of Soviet camps deep in Poland. The number at the top of the first page was 5,217. That was how many American soldiers Koch's team had documented, verified, and confirmed as held in Soviet custody after the end of the war. Not missing, not unaccounted for. Held, deliberately, behind wire, by an ally. Patton stood up and walked to the map on his office wall. Europe spread out in front of him. The red line dividing American-controlled territory from Soviet territory cut through the heart of Germany like a wound. He put his finger on it and didn't speak for a long time. These boys survived Hitler. He finally said, they survived German camps, German winters, German bullets. They made it through the worst thing the 20th century ever produced. And now they're sitting in Stalin's camps, wondering why nobody's coming for them. Koch didn't answer, because there was no answer that would satisfy either of them. Patton sent the complete file to Eisenhower with a message that was 3 sentences long. 5. 217 American POWs unaccounted for. Last confirmed in Soviet custody. Yalta Agreement mandates immediate return. Eisenhower forwarded it through diplomatic channels. The Soviets responded 13 days later. They denied everything. They claimed all liberated prisoners had been processed and returned according to the Yalta Protocols. Their records were complete and accurate. If American command believed otherwise, they were mistaken. Patton read the Soviet denial and felt something shift behind his eyes. He had read German denials during the war. He had read official statements from men who were building death camps while writing reassuring letters to the Red Cross. He knew what institutional lying looked like. This was institutional lying. June 15, 1945. Eisenhower called a meeting at SHAEF headquarters. Senior Allied commanders around a table in Bavaria, deciding how hard to push Stalin over 5,000 missing Americans. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery spoke first. His voice was the voice of pragmatism, smooth and cold. The Soviets are difficult partners, he said, but they are partners. The war in the Pacific continues. Soviet entry into that theater could save 100,000 American lives. We cannot afford a diplomatic crisis over this matter. These men will be returned eventually. Patton stood up before Montgomery finished his sentence. Eventually. The word came out of him like something he was spitting. While we sit here choosing our words carefully, 5,000 Americans are rotting in Soviet camps. They survived Hitler. They don't deserve to become Stalin's bargaining chips while we worry about diplomatic optics. Eisenhower raised his hand. George, sit down. We all want those men home. But we have to think strategically. The alliance matters. Patton didn't sit down. He put both hands on the table and looked at Eisenhower directly. The alliance is already dead, Ike. Stalin is building an empire in Eastern Europe right now while we're sitting in this room. He's installing puppet governments. He's moving borders. He's erasing countries. And we're talking about patience. Those men trusted us to bring them home. They deserve more than patience. The room went quiet. Every man at that table knew Patton was right. Every man at that table also knew that knowing something is right and being able to act on it are two completely different things. The war in the Pacific was real. Soviet cooperation was real. 5,000 prisoners were real. And the politics were crushing all three simultaneously. Eisenhower made his decision. Diplomatic pressure. Proper channels. No military action. No provocations. He looked at Patton when he said it. George, that's an order. Patton saluted. Yes, sir. His face said something completely different. That night, Patton spread maps across his desk with his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay. The maps showed the suspected camp locations, the distances, the Soviet troop deployments, the border crossings. Patton's finger traced the red line on the map the way a man traces a wound he intends to close. He looked at Gay. Stalin only understands one language, he said. And it isn't French. Gay leaned forward. Sir Eisenhower ordered no military action. I heard what Eisenhower ordered, Patton said. I'm not planning military action. I'm planning a military presence. There is a difference. Gay smiled slightly because he understood exactly what that difference meant in Patton's vocabulary. American tanks on the Soviet border. Not crossing it. Not threatening to cross it. Just existing on it, visible and deliberate, the way a closed fist is different from a raised one, but communicates something that words cannot. Patton needed approval to move divisions. He needed an ally with influence. On June 18th, he found one. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. Patton's superior, his friend, a man who had fought alongside him from North Africa through the heart of Germany. A man who understood what it cost to leave men behind. Patton poured 2 glasses of whiskey and laid out his plan across 45 minutes. Move Third Army units to the Soviet border. Not provocatively, visibly. Tanks, artillery, infantry. Position them at key crossing points. Make it unmistakably clear that American command knows exactly where those camps are and has no intention of leaving the border until the men inside them come home. Bradley listened without interrupting. He studied the maps. He calculated the risks. If you do this, the Soviets will see it as a threat. They might mobilize their own forces. Patton nodded. Let them. The more troops they move to watch us, the more it costs them. The more visible it becomes that holding our men isn't worth the confrontation. Bradley sat with it for a long moment. Then he approved limited redeployment, 1 armored division and supporting units to forward positions near the Soviet zone. He looked at Patton the way a man looks at fire. You do not cross that line. You do not engage Soviet forces. This is pressure, not war. Patton smiled. Understood. June 22nd, 1945. American tanks rolled east. M4 Shermans, M26 Pershings, artillery batteries, infantry companies. They moved in column formation toward the border between American and Soviet occupation zones and stopped precisely at the line. Not 1 inch past it, but visible for miles. Visible from every Soviet observation post along that sector. Reports went up the Soviet chain of command within hours. American military buildup on the border. Tanks, artillery, infantry. Purpose unknown. Posture aggressive. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, senior Soviet commander in Germany, received those reports and felt something he had not expected. He had expected diplomatic letters. He had expected meetings with men in suits who chose their words carefully. He had not expected Patton. Zhukov contacted Eisenhower directly. General Eisenhower, why are American forces massing on our border? This appears to be a hostile act. Eisenhower's response was precisely worded. Marshal Zhukov, General Patton is concerned about American personnel in your custody. He wants to ensure their safe return according to Yalta protocols. The conversation continued. Zhukov pushed. Eisenhower held. And then Eisenhower said the sentence that changed the calculation. Marshal, we have documented evidence of 5,217 American military personnel in Soviet custody. We have their names, their ranks, their units. We have testimonies from escaped prisoners. We have reconnaissance photographs of the camps. We know they are there. A pause on the line so long that Eisenhower thought the connection had failed. Then Zhukov said 3 words that confirmed Patton's entire theory. Very well. We will review our records again. 3 months of diplomatic letters had produced polite denials. 3 days of American tanks on the border produced a review. Patton ordered his commanders to maintain high visibility. Daily patrols along the border. Artillery drills visible from Soviet positions. Tank maneuvers. The same message every day delivered in metal and engine noise. We are here. We are not leaving. Return our men. The Soviet guards at the prison camps heard the artillery in the distance. American artillery. They told each other it was routine. The American prisoners heard it too, and they told each other something different. Something was happening. Something had changed. Someone had not forgotten them. June 29, 1945. The first group of Americans crossed the border at Magdeburg. 200 men, thin, exhausted, alive. Patton was standing at that crossing point when they came through. He shook every hand. He asked every man about the camps, about their treatment, about what they had witnessed in Soviet-controlled territory. The answers were consistent. The Soviets hadn't been cruel for cruelty's sake. They had been strategic. They didn't want American eyes seeing what Soviet liberation actually looked like. The confiscations, the arrests, the brutal occupation of populations who had expected rescue and received a different kind of captivity. One private from Ohio grabbed Patton's hand with both of his. The man's grip was weak, but his eyes were completely certain. "General, we thought you forgot about us. We thought nobody was coming." Patton's jaw tightened until the muscles showed through the skin. "I don't forget my men, son. Not ever." Over the next 2 weeks, more groups came through. 100 at a time, 200, 300. By July 15, 1945, more than 4,800 Americans had been returned to American lines. But the releases slowed. Then they stopped. The Soviets claimed their records were complete. All American prisoners had been returned. If additional names existed on American lists, those men must have died in German captivity, or deserted, or been misidentified. Patton had 200 names that told a different story. 200 Americans still unaccounted for. 200 men the Soviets were pretending had never existed. And Patton had just received intelligence from a source inside Soviet-controlled territory that told him exactly where they were and exactly why Stalin had no intention of releasing them. In Part 2, Patton will do something that Eisenhower will order him never to do. Something that will bring him within inches of starting a shooting war with the Soviet Union. Something that his own government will deny ever happened for the next 50 years. The tanks at the border were only the beginning. What came next was darker, more dangerous, and completely unauthorized. And it would cost Patton everything. Patton had his tanks on the Soviet border. Stalin blinked. 4,800 Americans came home. But 200 men were still behind Soviet wire, and the Soviets were pretending those men had never existed. Patton had their names. He had testimony from escaped prisoners. He had reconnaissance photographs. And he had just received intelligence from an operative inside Soviet-controlled Poland that told him exactly why Stalin would never release those 200 men through any diplomatic channel ever. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They had been in German camps near Soviet military installations when the Red Army swept through. They had seen Soviet troop movements, Soviet equipment configurations, Soviet operational patterns. Stalin didn't want that intelligence walking back into American debriefing rooms. So he reclassified them. Not prisoners of war, political detainees, enemies of the Soviet state. The Yalta Agreement didn't apply to enemies. The door was closed officially permanently, and Eisenhower had just ordered Patton to stop knocking. That order came on August 1, 1945. Eisenhower's voice on the telephone was the voice of a man who had made peace with an impossible situation. "George, those men are likely dead. We cannot risk the peace for corpses." Patton's response came without a pause. "They are not corpses, Ike. They are prisoners. And I have proof." "Then send it through proper channels," Eisenhower said. "Let the State Department handle it." Patton said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, "Crystal clear, sir." He hung up and turned to Colonel Koch. "How many men can we trust?" he said. "Men who won't ask questions." Koch gave him a number. 30. Special Operations veterans, Rangers, OSS operatives. Men who had spent the last 4 years doing things that official records would never acknowledge. Koch spent 48 hours finding them. Patton spent those same 48 hours studying maps of Soviet-controlled Poland with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was about to do would either bring 30 Americans home or end his career and possibly start a war. August 5, 1945. Patton's intelligence team had located a specific facility, a former German prison outside Poznan, Poland, converted by the NKVD Soviet secret police into a detention center for individuals whose existence was inconvenient. Approximately 60 Americans were confirmed inside based on photographs taken by an operative who had spent 3 weeks inside Soviet territory disguised as a Polish laborer. The operative's name was never recorded. He reported directly to Koch, and Koch reported directly to Patton. Patton called a meeting in a closed hangar at a forward airfield. No insignia on the building. No official log of the gathering. 30 men in unmarked clothing sat on crates and ammunition boxes and looked at their general. Patton stood at a map pinned to a wooden board and spoke without notes. "Gentlemen, you're going to cross into Soviet territory. Your mission is to locate and extract American prisoners from an NKVD facility near Poznan. This operation does not exist. If you are captured, we cannot help you. If you die, your families will be told training accident. You can walk out of this hangar right now. No record, no shame, no questions." He stopped talking and looked at the room. Nobody moved. Not one man. Patton nodded once. "Then let's bring our brothers home." The plan had 3 components operating simultaneously. Group 112 men would cross the border first and hit Soviet supply convoys in the countryside west of Poznan. Small raids, fast and brutal, designed to look exactly like Polish partisan activity which had been ongoing for months. The goal was to pull Soviet security forces away from the prison facility and scatter their attention across a 50-mile radius. Group 2. 10 men would move on the facility itself during the window created by Group 1. Cut wire, neutralize guards, enter the compound, and extract the prisoners. Group 3 8 men would be waiting 2 miles west with trucks, false documents, and a route through back roads that avoided every Soviet checkpoint between Poznan and the American zone. The operation launched on September 10, 1945. Group 1 crossed the border at midnight and hit their first convoy before 2 in the morning. 3 Soviet trucks destroyed. Ammunition supply disrupted. Radio traffic across Soviet channels immediately spiked as security forces mobilized to hunt Polish partisans who didn't exist. At the Poznan facility, the guard force dropped from 18 men to 11 as 7 soldiers were sent to support the search. Group 2 moved at 3 in the morning. The facility had 1 perimeter fence guard towers at each corner and a main gate with 2 men posted. Group 2's leader, a ranger captain, counted the guard rotations for 90 minutes before moving. The northwest corner had a gap, 40 seconds between passes. He took it. They cut through the fence in 4 places, entered the compound from 2 directions simultaneously. The first 2 guards were neutralized before either could speak. The third heard something and turned. He raised his rifle. The ranger captain dropped him with a silenced shot before the barrel cleared his shoulder. The 4th guard ran for the command building and made it 10 steps before he went down. But the shout had already happened. Lights came on. Voices inside the command building. Boots on wooden floors. Time collapsed from minutes to seconds. The ranger captain kicked open the first barracks door. Inside were 31 Americans. Thin men in torn clothing who stared at him like they were seeing something that couldn't be real. "U.S. Army," he said. "We're leaving. Now. Move. Military training is a permanent thing. It doesn't leave a man even after months behind wire." Those 31 men were on their feet and moving before he finished the sentence. The second barracks held 27 more. Same reaction, same response. 58 Americans running through a Soviet compound in the dark, while NKVD soldiers poured out of the command building with weapons and flashlights, and the kind of anger that comes from being caught doing something that was supposed to be secret. Gunfire. Group 2 returned it while moving, covering the prisoners toward the fence. 3 Americans went down wounded. Group 2's men grabbed them without breaking stride. Nobody left behind. They hit the fence at 4 different points and went through like water through gaps in stone. Group 3 was exactly where they were supposed to be. Engines running. Tailgates down. The Americans climbed in and packed themselves into the truck beds like cargo. Group 2 followed, last men through the wire. The trucks drove west without headlights for the first 6 miles. Behind them, Soviet pursuit vehicles came out of the facility in force, Group 1 hit the lead pursuit truck with an anti-tank weapon at a crossroads 4 miles east of the extraction route, destroyed it completely, blocked the road with burning wreckage, and then disappeared into the countryside by foot, each man navigating independently toward a rally point inside American territory. September 11th, 1945. Dawn was breaking gray and cold over the border crossing at the edge of the American zone when the trucks came through. Patton was standing on the American side of the line with Coke and 2 medical officers. He watched the truck stop, watched the tailgates come down, watched 58 Americans climb out onto free ground for the first time in months. A captain named William Foster walked to Patton and saluted with an arm that was visibly shaking. "3rd Infantry Division, sir. We didn't think anyone was coming." Patton returned the salute. He looked at the man's face at the evidence of what Soviet custody had cost him and kept his voice level. "I don't leave my men behind, Captain. Not for politics, not for orders, not for anything." The diplomatic fallout arrived within 48 hours. The Soviets filed formal protests with SHAEF. They accused American forces of raiding a Soviet installation, killing Soviet personnel, violating international borders, and conducting military operations inside Soviet-controlled territory. Washington denied everything. No U.S. forces had crossed into Soviet territory. The prisoners must have escaped on their own. "Remarkable men," Eisenhower's office said. "Remarkable circumstances." The Soviets knew exactly what had happened. They could not prove it in any forum that mattered because acknowledging the raid meant acknowledging the prison, which meant acknowledging why those Americans had been held there in the first place, which meant opening a conversation about what Soviet liberation had actually looked like across Eastern Europe. Stalin was not going to have that conversation. Eisenhower called Patton the morning after the extraction. "George, tell me you didn't." "Didn't what, Sir?" Patton said. "You know exactly what." Patton's voice was entirely calm. 58 Americans returned to our lines yesterday. Apparently they escaped Soviet custody on their own. Remarkable men." A long silence. Then Eisenhower said there will be consequences. Patton said, "I understand, sir. But those 58 men are home. That's what matters." The consequences came on September 20th, 1945. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. The official reason given was controversial public statements about denazification policy. Everyone in uniform understood the real reason. Nobody said it out loud. Patton was reassigned to historical documentation work. A warrior buried in paperwork in a quiet office in Bavaria, while the army he had built was demobilized around him. He kept writing letters. To Washington, to the State Department, to Eisenhower, to anyone with the authority to keep pushing on the remaining missing Americans, the ones the Poznan raid hadn't reached, the ones in facilities deeper inside Soviet territory that his operatives hadn't been able to confirm. Most letters were not answered. Some were answered with language so carefully empty that they communicated nothing except the desire to communicate nothing. The Cold War was organizing itself around him, and individual soldiers were becoming casualties of something larger than any of them. But the 58 men from Poznan were home. The 4,800 from the border standoff were home. And in 3 months, something was going to happen on a quiet road in Mannheim, Germany, that would silence Patton permanently before he could tell anyone what he knew about what Stalin had done and what the American government had chosen to look away from. In Part 3, we will find out what was in that NKVD memo that a Russian archivist pulled from the KGB files in 1991. 4 words in Stalin's handwriting in the margin. 4 words that pointed directly at that road in Mannheim and the truck that came out of a side street on a December morning. And we will find out what happened to the men Patton never reached. The ones who waited behind Soviet wire for decades. The ones whose families received letters that said missing in action status unknown for 50 years. The full truth of what the Cold War cost at the level of individual human beings. And it is darker than anything you have heard so far. Patton moved tanks to the Soviet border. Stalin released 4,800 Americans. Then Patton sent 30 men without insignia into Soviet-controlled Poland and pulled 58 more out of an NKVD prison by force. He was relieved of command 10 days later. The official reason was a lie. Everyone knew it. And then on December 9, 1945, a truck pulled out of a side road in Mannheim and changed everything. But before that road in Mannheim, the Soviets had a problem. The Poznan raid had exposed something they could not afford to have exposed. American forces had penetrated Soviet-controlled territory, neutralized NKVD guards, and extracted prisoners that the Soviet government had officially declared non-existent. The operation was deniable on the American side. It was not deniable on the Soviet side. Beria knew exactly what had happened. His guards were dead. His prisoners were gone. And the Americans had done it cleanly enough that there was nothing Moscow could put in front of a diplomatic tribunal without admitting the prison had existed. Beria's memo to Stalin, dated September 12, 1945, was 3 paragraphs. The first described the raid in operational terms: 58 prisoners taken, 4 NKVD personnel killed, perimeter compromised at multiple points, simultaneously indicating professional military coordination. The second paragraph assessed responsibility. General Patton's work without question. Coordinated, rehearsed, executed with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years thinking about how to take things from people who didn't want to give them up. The third paragraph was a recommendation. Stalin's response was found in the margin. 4 words in his handwriting. Patton is a problem. Below that, 2 more words. Handle it. 3 months later, December 9, 1945. The road outside Mannheim was icy and quiet. Patton was in the back seat of a Cadillac staff car with General Hobart Gay. They were going pheasant hunting. A rare morning without paperwork, without letters that nobody answered, without the particular silence of a man who had been put somewhere he couldn't do damage. The driver was relaxed. The road was empty. At 11:45 in the morning, an army truck pulled out from a side road without stopping. The Cadillac's driver swerved. Not enough. The collision was low speed. The truck was barely dented. Gay was bruised. The driver was shaken. Patton's neck snapped against the partition behind the front seat. Spinal cord severed. Complete paralysis from the neck down. The man who had survived North Africa, Sicily, the Bulge, and the Soviet border standoff was destroyed by a fender bender on a quiet German road. He died 12 days later without recovering consciousness. December 21, 1945. He never spoke again. He never told anyone what he knew about the missing Americans deeper inside Soviet territory, about the NKVD facilities his operatives had identified, but never reached, about what Stalin's occupation of Eastern Europe actually looked like at the level of individual human beings. The army called it a tragic accident. The investigation was cursory. The truck driver was never properly identified in any official record that survived. The file was closed. Patton was buried in Luxembourg in the military cemetery at Ham, among the men of the Third Army he had commanded. He had asked to be buried with his soldiers. That request at least was honored. But the questions didn't close with the file. Soviet archives were sealed for 46 years. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, and Boris Yeltsin ordered KGB records open to researchers, American historians found Beria's memo within 18 months. They found Stalin's handwritten response. They found the timing. September 12, 1945. Stalin writes, "Handle it." December 9, 1945. Patton is paralyzed by a collision that kills no one else and leaves the other vehicle barely scratched. No historian has been able to prove assassination. No historian who has read the full file has been able to dismiss it comfortably either. The truck driver's identity remains officially unresolved. The investigation records were incomplete in ways that investigators in 1945 should have noticed and didn't. The NKVD had extensive networks inside the American occupation zone in Germany. They had demonstrated the capacity and the willingness to operate inside American-controlled territory. And Stalin had written 2 words in the margin of a memo about Patton 3 months before Patton died. The truth went with the men who knew it. Stalin died in 1953. Beria was executed the same year, 6 months later, by the people who replaced Stalin. Whatever operational knowledge existed about December 9th died in the political purges that followed Soviet leadership transitions. We are left with timing, with motive, with a file that raises questions it cannot answer, and with a dead general who cannot speak for himself. What we can speak to is what happened to the men he saved and the men he didn't reach. Captain Robert Shaw returned to Detroit and worked as a machinist for 40 years. He married in 1947. He had 3 children. He named his son George. He gave one interview to a local newspaper in 1987 when Soviet documents began entering public circulation, and he said 3 things clearly. He said they thought America had forgotten them. He said Patton proved they were wrong. He said he named his son George because of what that proof cost the man who provided it. Captain William Foster could not find civilian life after his months in Soviet custody. The war had ended, but something in him had not. He rejoined the Army in 1946, served in Korea as a company commander, and retired as a colonel in 1968. He spent his retirement years lobbying Congress to declassify documents related to the Soviet prisoner situation, to acknowledge officially what Stalin had done and what the American government had chosen to manage quietly rather than confront publicly. He testified before 2 Senate subcommittees. He submitted formal requests to 4 different administrations. He convinced exactly nobody in Washington that the story deserved official acknowledgement. He died in 1995, still trying. The other returned prisoners scattered across the country and mostly tried to forget. PTSD was not a diagnosis in 1945. It was not treated. It was not discussed. Men who had survived German camps and then Soviet camps and then come home to a country that had already moved on were expected to move on with it. Many did, at least on the surface. Some drank. Some found that the life waiting for them on the other side of the ocean felt like it belonged to someone else. A smaller number thrived, genuinely built families and careers, and carried their experiences quietly without being destroyed by them. The 200 who never came home left a different kind of aftermath. Their families wrote letters to the War Department for years. Formal requests, inquiries. Some families hired lawyers. Some contacted their congressional representatives. They received form responses. Missing in action. Status unknown. The language was precise in its imprecision, designed to communicate nothing except the government's awareness that a question existed. When Soviet archives opened in the 1990s, researchers found records of American prisoners who had died in NKVD custody. Causes of death listed clinically. Dates and locations of burial in unmarked graves across Poland, Eastern Germany, and Czechoslovakia. Some families received confirmation of death 50 years after the fact. Some received nothing because the records were incomplete, or because the prisoners had been processed under false names, or because the documentation simply hadn't survived the decades. What survived was the principle Patton had established imperfectly, expensively, and in direct violation of orders. America does not leave its soldiers behind. Not for diplomacy. Not for politics. Not for the convenience of an alliance that was already becoming something other than an alliance. The principle didn't emerge cleanly from the events of 1945. It emerged contested, partial, achieved only for 4,858 of the 5,217 documented prisoners at the cost of Patton's command and possibly his life, and with 200 names that remained on no official list of the recovered. But it emerged. The Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, established formally in 1973, institutionalized what Patton had demonstrated through improvisation. Missing service members are not statistics to be managed. They are individuals whose fate the government is obligated to determine. The agency has recovered and identified remains from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam continuously since its founding. It is still operating today. The obligation does not expire. Patton's confrontation with Stalin in the summer of 1945 was also, in retrospect, the first clear articulation of what the Cold War would be. He understood before most people in positions of authority were willing to understand that the Soviet Union was not transforming back into a manageable partner after the common enemy was defeated. It was expanding. It was consolidating. It was building the architecture of control across Eastern Europe that would define the next 46 years of global politics. His tanks on the border in June 1945 were the first Western military signal that this expansion had a limit someone was willing to enforce. He was removed before he could push further. The men who replaced him were more patient with the process of negotiation, more willing to accept the ambiguity of Soviet behavior as a feature of an ongoing relationship rather than evidence of a fundamental opposition. They were not wrong about the complexity, but Patton had not been wrong about the opposition. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe exactly as he had described it to Eisenhower in that meeting in Bavaria. The Berlin airlift, the Korean War Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968. The decades of proxy conflict that followed all confirmed what Patton had diagnosed in the summer, when everyone else was still trying to believe the alliance could survive peacetime. He didn't live to see any of it confirmed. He died in December 1945, 3 years before the Berlin blockade, 5 years before Korea, 46 years before the Soviet Union ceased to exist. He left behind a principle that outlasted the empire he had confronted, a principle paid for in the lives of the men who went into Poland without insignia, and in the lives of the men they didn't reach, and in 12 days on a hospital bed in Heidelberg, paralyzed, unconscious, silent. The question Patton forced into the open in 1945 was not resolved by his death. It was not resolved by the Cold War ending. It is the permanent question underneath every decision a government makes about how much it will risk for the people it sent into danger. Whether the cost of bringing them home is worth paying. When paying it complicates everything else. Patton's answer was yes, always yes, regardless of the complications, regardless of the orders, regardless of what it cost him personally. That answer is the reason 4,858 men came home, and it is the reason the question still matters. Patton moved tanks to the Soviet border, and Stalin released 4,800 Americans. Then he sent 30 men without insignia into Poland and pulled 58 more out of an NKVD prison by force. He was relieved of command. Then a truck came out of a side road in Mannheim and silenced him permanently. Stalin's 4 words in the margin of Beria's memo. The timing that no official investigation ever satisfactorily explained. And 200 Americans who never came home. That was where Part 3 left us. Now the question that remains is the one that always remains after a story like this. What happened to the man who did all of it? And does the answer change what the story means? George Patton died on December 21, 1945 in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. He was 60 years old. He had been unconscious for 12 days. He never regained consciousness after the collision on the Mannheim Road. He never knew whether Washington had acted on any of his letters about the remaining missing Americans. He never knew whether the men from Poznan had successfully rebuilt their lives. He never saw the Cold War he had predicted take the shape he had described to Eisenhower in that meeting in Bavaria. He died with unfinished business, which is perhaps the only way a man like Patton could have died. He was buried at Ham, Luxembourg, in the American Military Cemetery among soldiers of the Third Army. He had requested this specifically. He had said he wanted to be where his men were. The Army honored that request without hesitation, which was the last uncomplicated thing the institution did for him. His wife Beatrice sailed to Europe and stood at the grave in December cold and said nothing for a long time. General Omar Bradley, who had approved the limited redeployment to the Soviet border, who had given Patton the authorization that made the tank standoff possible, attended the funeral. He stood at attention in the Luxembourg cemetery and thought about the conversation in Bavaria, where Patton had poured 2 glasses of whiskey and laid out a plan that everyone knew was right, and almost nobody had the authority to execute. Bradley lived until 1981. He never publicly discussed what he knew about the Poznan operation. He took that knowledge with him. Eisenhower became president in 1953. He governed the early Cold War with the patience and strategic caution that had defined his command in Europe. He understood the Soviet threat precisely as Patton had described it. He managed it differently through diplomacy and deterrence, and the long, slow pressure of economic and ideological competition, rather than through tanks on borders and unauthorized raids. History has judged both approaches as necessary in different contexts. Eisenhower's approach lasted longer. Patton's approach brought 4,858 men home in the summer of 1945. The men Patton brought home carried his memory in different ways. Captain Robert Shaw, the Detroit machinist, who had been the first to escape Soviet custody and whose testimony had put the entire crisis in motion, worked at the Ford River Rouge plant for 4 decades after the war. He was a quiet man by all accounts. His co-workers knew he had served. They didn't know the specifics. He didn't talk about it at work or at the VFW post where he occasionally appeared for holidays. His wife knew more than anyone outside the family. His son George knew enough. In 1987, when a reporter from the Detroit Free Press contacted him after Soviet documents began circulating in academic journals, Shaw gave a single interview. He described the Soviet camp. He described the escape. He described the moment he saw the American Jeep on the road after 3 days walking through Polish countryside. He said that moment was the most important of his life. He said he had named his son George because a general had refused to accept a diplomatic excuse when 5,000 Americans needed someone to refuse it. Captain William Foster. The man pulled from Poznan in September 1945 never found the quiet that Shaw found. He served in Korea. He retired as a colonel. He spent 27 years after retirement writing letters to senators and submitting Freedom of Information Act requests and testifying before subcommittees that listened politely and changed nothing. He wanted official acknowledgement, not for himself specifically, for the record. He wanted the historical record to reflect what Stalin had done and what Patton had done about it, and what the American government had chosen to look away from. He died in 1995 without receiving that acknowledgement from any administration. The acknowledgement came 8 years after his death in 2003, when declassified documents confirmed the outline of what he had spent decades trying to establish as official truth. He did not live to read them. This is the kind of thing that happens to people who are right too early. But the principle Patton established did not wait for official documents to take effect. It moved through military culture in the way that important things move not through formal channels, but through the accumulated weight of example and expectation. Every prisoner exchange negotiation after 1945 carried the implicit memory of what happened when those negotiations failed and what one general had done about the failure. Every missing service member case processed by what eventually became the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency existed within a framework that Patton had defined through action before anyone had thought to define it through policy. The agency was formally established in 1973, 28 years after Patton's death. It has recovered and identified more than 1,000 sets of remains from World War II alone since its founding. It operates recovery missions in Europe, in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia. It employs forensic anthropologists, historians, and investigators whose entire professional purpose is to answer the question that Patton answered with tanks and unauthorized raids in 1945. Where are our people, and how do we bring them home? The answer has changed in form, but not in substance. The obligation does not expire with the generation that incurred it. The military doctrine of personnel recovery formalized across NATO and adopted by Allied militaries worldwide traces its conceptual origins to the post-World War II reckoning with what happened to American prisoners in Soviet hands. The specific lesson that diplomatic channels alone are insufficient when a hostile power decides to ignore its obligations shaped the planning assumptions of every subsequent conflict. In Korea, when China held American POWs during and after the armistice negotiations, American negotiators operated with a different baseline expectation than the one that had allowed Stalin to stall for weeks in 1945. The baseline had been reset by what Patton had demonstrated was possible when someone refused to accept the stalling. In Vietnam, the prisoner of war issue became a defining political struggle of the conflict's final years and its aftermath precisely because the cultural expectation Patton had helped establish made any government claim that missing Americans were simply gone unacceptable to the public in a way it might not have been before 1945. The bracelets, the campaigns, the Senate Select Committee that investigated POW and MIA cases in 1991 and 1992. All of it existed within a framework of public expectation that soldiers are not statistics and their fate is the government's permanent obligation. Patton did not create that expectation alone, but he demonstrated it operationally at the moment when demonstrating it was most expensive and most necessary. The byhook that runs underneath all of this is not primarily about military tactics or Cold War geopolitics. It is about the gap between institutional behavior and individual responsibility, and what happens when someone with enough authority and enough courage decides to close that gap personally. Every institution in 1945 had reasons to accept the Soviet position on the prisoners. SHAEF had diplomatic reasons. The State Department had strategic reasons. The Joint Chiefs had Pacific Theater reasons. Every reason was real. Every reason pointed toward the same outcome, which was 5,217 Americans remaining in Soviet custody indefinitely while the institution processed its competing priorities. Patton looked at those competing priorities and made a different calculation. He calculated that the obligation to the men outweighed the inconvenience to the institution. He was insubordinate in doing so. He violated international law in doing so. He was relieved of command in consequence, and may have been killed in further consequence. And 4,858 men came home who would not otherwise have come home because he was willing to pay those costs without being asked whether he was willing. This pattern repeats in history with enough regularity that it has a shape recognizable across contexts. The person who sees what the institution cannot bring itself to see, who acts on what the institution cannot bring itself to act on, who pays the cost that the institution distributes across everyone else. Churchill in the 1930s, warning about Germany while the institution processed appeasement. The doctors who pushed back against standard treatment protocols when the protocols were failing patients. The engineers who escalated safety concerns before disasters that institutional processes had classified as acceptable risks. The shape is always the same. The institution is not evil. It is processing competing priorities through established channels, and the channels are inadequate for the actual problem. And someone finally decides to be inadequate to the channels instead. Now the detail that most accounts of this story omit. The detail that was buried in the 2003 declassification and has not received the attention it deserves. Among the documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests in 2003 was an internal Army memo dated October 3, 1945, 2 weeks after the Poznan raid, written by an officer in the Historical Documentation section to which Patton had been reassigned after his relief of command. The memo was a routine summary of Patton's activities in his new role. It noted that he had been reviewing records of Third Army operations from 1944 and 1945. It noted that he had requested specific files related to prisoner of war liberation operations in the final months of the European War. But then there was a handwritten addition at the bottom of the memo, not in the writing of the officer who drafted it. In Patton's own handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed orders moving tank divisions to the Soviet border, the same handwriting that had written letters nobody answered, demanding action on the remaining missing Americans. There was a list of names, 43 names, American soldiers, with the notation beside each one still missing, confirmed alive as of August 1945. It was not an official document. It was not submitted through any channel. It was a personal record kept by a man who had been removed from his position and given paperwork to occupy his time, who was using the access that paperwork gave him to continue tracking the men he had not been able to reach. He was maintaining the list in October 1945. He was still maintaining it, still looking, still refusing to accept that 43 names were simply gone 6 weeks before the road in Mannheim. The list was filed with his personal papers after his death. It passed to the Army Historical Collection and sat in an archive for 58 years until the 2003 declassification brought it into daylight. Nobody in 1945 knew it existed. Nobody in the administrations that received Foster's letters and ignored them knew it existed. It was a dead general's private refusal to stop counting. From a mechanic's testimony in a Bavaria office to tanks on the Soviet border, from an unauthorized raid in Poland to a list of 43 names maintained in secret until death. Patton demonstrated in every form available to him that the obligation to the men did not end when the institution decided the situation was too complicated to resolve. He paid for that demonstration with his command, with his reputation, and likely with his life. And because he paid it, 4,858 Americans came home. A military doctrine was shaped, an agency was founded, and the expectation was established that soldiers are not statistics and their fate is permanent business. The question this story asks is not whether Patton was right. History answered that. The question is, what you do when the institution is wrong and you are the person who can see it. Patton's answer was to move tanks, to send men without insignia, to maintain a list of 43 names in a historical documentation office in Bavaria, while writing letters nobody read, to keep going until he couldn't. That is the answer the story preserves. Not the tanks, not the raid, the list. The private unwitnessed refusal to stop counting, because that is what it actually looks like when someone decides that the obligation does not expire.